Where do you think we're at on that adoption curve? And does this mark a specific inflection point?
Yeah. So this is one of the first pieces of analysis I did for Bitcoin. We're way, way earlier than people typically think, because it doesn't feel possible that we can still be this early, but we are. There's 4 million addresses on chain that have 0.1 or more Bitcoin in them. So that's a significant amount of savings, right? Like you've adopted Bitcoin. Let's say you've adopted Bitcoin if you have, I guess that's $8,000 in an address you control on chain. And then, round that up for people who have Bitcoin on exchanges. And, like there is the question of, have you truly adopted Bitcoin if you have left your Bitcoin on exchange, or like it's just in Microstrategy or an ETF? But sure, let's round up. Call it 10 or 20 million people have some significant savings in Bitcoin. They get it. But there's 8 billion people in the world. So you're still talking about, let's say 0.2% of the world has adopted Bitcoin at this point in time, at that threshold that we've outlined. And that's super different from some of the numbers you see where, you'll see the number of like, oh, there's 200 million people have adopted Bitcoin, but not really. What they're actually talking about is how many people have like ever been a user of Coinbase and any other crypto exchange, and maybe had $5 on Coinbase. And, that's everybody. That's everybody in the US. All my yuppie elite friends, they all have some tiny stash of crypto that they don't understand. And, they're hoping that it's a lottery ticket, but that's not adoption of Bitcoin. So true adoption of Bitcoin, people who get it and have shifted a material amount of savings into Bitcoin is something like 20 million, which is, 0.2% of the world. And in the classic bell curve of technology adopters, the first 2.5% is the innovators. That's the first category. 2.5%, we're 0.2% into that, by my math. So we're still in the very early stages of innovators, even though it feels like we're like crossing the chasm into, from early adopters into early majority. But we're not. We're way before that. We're still in innovators. And, I think that people get excited about try to inflate those numbers about how many people have adopted Bitcoin because the industry, the crypto industry more broadly, wants to be taken seriously and look big. But, from a Bitcoin perspective, it doesn't do us it doesn't do us any good to inflate those numbers, because it's better to look at the reality and realize it's a lot earlier than people typically think, because when you get that appropriate perspective, you realize 99.8% of the world is still behind me. And that means that I can be stacking sats before all these people show up and bid up the price of Bitcoin. So yeah, that's my perspective on how early we are. It's way, way earlier than people typically acknowledge.
I think that's it's such a hard thing to wrap your mind around, speaking personally, and as somebody who has put a lot of time into this, so much time that I had to start a podcast about it, but this idea that I've started stacking modestly in 2020 and, started that journey down the rabbit hole. I'm still going on that journey. But at that point, you see, I think it's very easy to look relative to the other people that you look up to, or that you see people that have been in since 2000, a few from 2010, 11, 12, 13, and you're like, oh my God, how can I possibly be early when these guys were buying Bitcoin for, a few dollars? Like that's, I'm still earlier than some, but I can't be that early. But when you look at it from the global perspective, again, if we're in that Bitcoin echo chamber of these are the people you're seeing, this is what you're inundated with all the time, it's easy to forget that the overwhelming, vast, almost, like a rounding error of people own Bitcoin at this point.
Yeah. Yes.
That's basically what it comes down to, right? Which is just kind of it's a very heartening thing, or it should be, for anyone who stumbles across this and does not yet have Bitcoin. You hear those numbers and it's like, oh wow, I'm still really early. But then it becomes a question of holy shit, if, whatever we're at right now, low 80 some thousand petrodollars, if that's really early, what does it look like when you actually get to that 2.5% of the end of the innovator phase and then the early adopter? What does that actually look like for people? I think the numbers start to get really hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah. Millions is what that starts to look like. Yeah, I love this topic. It's one of my favorite topics in Bitcoin, because I've written a couple articles about this to try to hit on this theme. And the overarching thing that always pops up for me is the trajectory of the American West. And you asked, like, where are we in terms of demarcation right now? We're somewhere around the California gold rush, like 1849 for Bitcoin. The Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803, suddenly opens up the West for westward expansion, and then Manifest Destiny sort of becomes the prevailing theme for the next 100 years for the US. And at first it was mountain men exploring, and there was absolutely no infrastructure. And then the mountain men start to make like the very earliest infrastructure, trading posts and sort of trails. And that's like the cypherpunks, the super OG Bitcoiners who started Kraken and other companies like that. And that early infrastructure allows for like early settlers to start moving across the country on the Oregon Trail and then the California Trail. And the first few years of the Oregon Trail, if you got to Oregon, you were gifted 640 acres for every married couple of like prime farmland. And then a few years later, that was cut to 320. And then a few years later, it was cut to 160. And then they ended the program a few years after that. You had to buy your land after that. And it's just a perfect analog for, the experience of being early to Bitcoin and then a little less early to Bitcoin. The first pioneers to Oregon, like half of them died. So you were taking a lot of risk. And if you got there, you got this, huge reward. And then as time goes by, the frontier becomes de-risked little by little as infrastructure builds out. And, more and more, it becomes accessible to more and more people. And that means prices get bid up for land. And that's the story of the American West sort of developing as a frontier. And we're living through, I think, an analogous frontier development with Bitcoin as the digital frontier, digital real estate that is, cheap still, but it was cheaper in the past. But I think, people now who are in the 0.2% of adopters who have arrived already on the frontier will look back on this as the golden age when you could buy a ranch for cheap, in Bitcoin equivalent terms. You can get to a whole coin, that's possible still. And it's probably not very accessible in 5-10 years. It's probably unthinkable for most people.
I love the idea that in Oregon, they literally had like a halving schedule.
Yes.
Of land allocation. That really is a perfect example there.